In the sweltering heat of the Magdalena Medio Valley in Colombia, where the air is thick enough to drink, lies a sprawling monument to a fractured memory. The road that leads to it is paved over old scars, a modern artery feeding into a heart of curated darkness. Tourists arrive in air-conditioned buses, seeking spectacle where a nation once witnessed its own unraveling. They come for the water slides, the life-sized dinosaurs, and the faint, marketable echo of terror. This place is called Hacienda Nápoles. Today it operates as a public theme park, a bizarre collage of family entertainment and macabre history. The laughter of children playing in chlorinated pools mixes with the humid silence of the surrounding jungle, creating a dissonance that hangs in the air, palpable and unsettling. The grounds are vast, a kingdom built to defy the world, now tamed and packaged for weekend consumption. What was once a fortress of impunity, a private citadel ruled by absolute power, is now governed by opening hours and ticket prices. The illusion of a tropical paradise is meticulously maintained, yet it is an illusion stretched thin over a foundation of bone and blood. Every manicured lawn, every brightly painted attraction, struggles to conceal the weight of the story buried just beneath the surface. The very soil seems to remember a different era. An era when the only visitors were either complicit or condemned, when decisions made beside these artificial lakes could bring a country to its knees. The transformation of this land from a nerve center of a criminal empire into a family destination is perhaps the most surreal chapter in its violent history, a testament to a collective and perhaps necessary amnesia. At the entrance, a weathered archway still stands, a relic of a bygone declaration of war. Upon it once sat a replica of a small Piper airplane, the very vessel that carried the first shipment of cocaine north, launching an enterprise that would drown continents in white powder and red ink. The plane is still there, a hollow symbol, its original defiance now reduced to a quaint, historical curiosity for vacation photos. This gate was not an invitation, but a proclamation. It was the frontispiece to a story of ambition so vast it sought to remake reality itself. To pass through it in its heyday was to leave the jurisdiction of the state and enter a sovereign territory, a personal fiefdom, where law was dictated by the whim of a single man. It was a threshold between the known world and a universe of grotesque fantasy. Now, tour guides recite a sanitized version of its significance, pointing it out between directions to the food court and the reptile house. The raw audacity of placing a monument to one's first crime at the very entrance to one's palace has been diluted into a historical anecdote, a piece of trivia for the paying public. The gate no longer separates worlds. It merely marks the beginning of the theme park. The estate sprawls over thousands of acres, a landscape of artificial lakes and rolling hills that were once meticulously sculpted to the owner's design. Hidden within this manufactured Eden were the mechanisms of a global trafficking operation. Clandestine airstrips, weapons caches, and secret meeting places disguised by the overwhelming spectacle of wealth. Power here was not just asserted, it was landscaped. Dotted across this terrain are the survivors of a different kind of extinction. Concrete dinosaurs, dozens of them, stand frozen in silent roars. A Tyrannosaurus rex looms over a picnic area, its fiberglass skin peeling under the relentless sun. These creatures were part of the original owner's private collection of wonders, a prehistoric court for a modern king. They were meant to inspire awe, to communicate a power that transcended human history, a dominion over the very concept of the wild and the ancient. Now they are simply kitsch, their symbolic weight stripped away, leaving only the hollow absurdity of their presence in the Colombian jungle. They have become props in a new narrative, one of family fun and harmless fantasy. The contrast is jarring. The bright, primary colors of the water park slides rise up against the jungle's deep green. Modern plastic structures bolted onto a land that has witnessed unimaginable brutality. The park is a palimpsest, a new text written hastily over an old one, but the original script bleeds through, visible in the cracks of the new facade. This place was designed as a psychological bunker, a fortress built not only of concrete and steel, but of myth and fear. Its luxury was a weapon, its extravagance a strategy. The opulence was meant to overwhelm, to signal that its creator operated on a plane far beyond the reach of ordinary men and their laws. But what the house concealed was far more complex than its ostentatious surface suggested. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside, few dared to know. To uncover the secrets hidden behind these crumbling walls and understand the mind that conceived it all, stay with us. Subscribe to follow our investigation into the anatomy of a fallen empire. The main villa, the colonial-style mansion that served as the heart of the estate, is no longer standing. Its skeleton has been picked clean, first by the state, then by scavengers. For years after the empire fell, treasure hunters known as guaceros descended upon the property, armed with shovels, dynamite, and legends of buried fortunes. They tore through walls, ripped up floors, and dug craters in the gardens, searching for the caletas, the secret stashes where millions in cash were rumored to be hidden. They were driven by the ghost of that immense wealth, a phantom that promised to change their lives, just as it had destroyed the life of the man who buried it. What remains of the house is a collection of ruins, a ghostly footprint on the land. A few tiled floors, exposed to the elements, hint at the grandeur that once was. An empty swimming pool, now cracked and filled with stagnant rainwater and weeds, serves as a silent basin of memory. It was here that deals were sealed and betrayals were plotted under the placid gaze of the tropical sun. The structure was not a home in any conventional sense. It was a stage. It was the backdrop for a carefully constructed performance of power, family, and benevolence. A performance that masked a reality of methodical violence. The walls themselves, now gone, were silent witnesses to conversations that decided the fate of individuals and the direction of a nation's agony. Further into the grounds lie the rusted cages of the private zoo, another of the estate's legendary features. This was once the largest private menagerie in the Americas, home to over 1,500 illegally imported animals. Elephants, giraffes, rhinos, and kangaroos lived and died here, prisoners in a gilded cage, trophies of a boundless ego. The collection was a testament to a power that could bend not just the will of men, but the laws of nature. To cage an African elephant in the heart of Colombia was the ultimate act of hubris, a demonstration that nothing was beyond the owner's reach. Each exotic creature was a subject in his personal kingdom, a living symbol of his global dominance. Today, the enclosures are empty and overgrown. The thick iron bars are flaking with rust, consumed by the humidity. The silence where the roars and calls of 100 different species once echoed is now profound, broken only by the chirping of local birds. The absence of the animals is more haunting than their presence ever was. The zoo was also a tool of propaganda. It was open to the public for free, a gesture of calculated generosity that helped build a myth. The man who brought these wonders to the poor communities of the region was seen not as a criminal, but as a benefactor, a paisa Robin Hood. This loyalty, bought with spectacle, became a human shield that was nearly impenetrable. But not all the animals are gone. One species was left behind, deemed too large, too aggressive, and too expensive to relocate. In the estate's many lakes, a small population of hippopotamuses, originally 1 male and 3 females, was abandoned to fend for itself. They were a biological loose end in the chaotic aftermath of the empire's collapse. Freed from their enclosures but trapped on the continent, they did what nature commanded. They survived, they thrived, they reproduced. The original 4 have become a sprawling population of over 160, the largest invasive species on the planet. They have moved beyond the borders of the estate, colonizing the Magdalena River basin. These creatures, with their immense bulk and unpredictable aggression, are a living, breathing legacy of the man who brought them here. They are an ecological disaster, born from a criminal's vanity. They wander the Colombian countryside like ghosts of a surreal past, a constant, dangerous reminder that some cages, once opened, unleash consequences that can never be contained again. Hacienda Nápoles is therefore not a dead ruin, it is an active haunting. The past is not past, it is a lumbering, semi-aquatic mammal disrupting ecosystems miles away. It is the uneasy feeling that settles on visitors as they move between a waterslide and a small museum dedicated to the life of the man who built this place. The estate is a paradox. It is a place of memory and forgetting, of horror and entertainment. It represents Colombia's complex, often painful relationship with its own history. The decision to turn a place of such profound darkness into a tourist attraction speaks volumes about the desire to move on and the impossibility of ever truly doing so. The land itself feels heavy, saturated with stories that the official narrative of the theme park cannot erase. The ground beneath the feet of laughing tourists is layered with secrets, with the weight of unseen and unacknowledged history. The air, thick with the scent of tropical flowers and popcorn, still carries a faint, metallic trace of fear. This was the world a man built to reflect his own image, grandiose, contradictory, and ultimately self-destructive. It was his Eden and his prison. Before it became this theme park of strange ironies, it was the epicenter of a war, a laboratory of ambition, and a theater of cruelty. To understand the fall, one must first understand the ascent and the mind that dared to build a paradise on an abyss. Before it was a ruin, and long before it was a theme park, the estate was an idea. It was a dream that took root in the mind of a man for whom the world as it existed was merely a set of obstacles to be overcome or obliterated. The architect of this vast and violent fantasy was born far from any palace, in the damp, unassuming earth of Rio Negro, a rural town in the Colombian highlands. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. His origins were modest, almost pastoral. The son of a humble farmer and a schoolteacher, he grew up in a world of defined limits and quiet aspirations. It was a landscape of small farms and steep hills, a place where fortunes were not made, but inherited in small parcels of land. This early proximity to scarcity would forge in him an insatiable hunger, not just for wealth, but for a scale of existence so immense it would erase the memory of his own insignificance. The first signs of his trajectory were not grand, but they were telling. A life of petty crime began in his teenage years on the streets of Medellin. Stolen tombstones, contraband cigarettes, forged diplomas. Each small transgression was a test of the system, a discovery of its vulnerabilities. He learned early that rules were for those who lacked the will to break them, and that fear was a currency more stable than the peso. Then came the 1970s, and with them, a historical opportunity. A white powder derived from the coca leaf began its inexorable march north, fueling an insatiable demand in the United States. Cocaine was not just a drug, it was a geopolitical force in waiting, a commodity with the power to mint kings from common criminals overnight. For a young man with boundless ambition and no moral compass, it was the discovery of a new world. Escobar did not invent the cocaine trade, but he perfected it. He saw its potential for industrial scale where others saw only smuggling routes. He envisioned a vertically integrated empire, a global corporation of crime that would control every step of the process, from the coca fields of the Andes to the nightclubs of Miami and New York. His genius was not in chemistry, but in logistics, brutality and vision. But money, even in quantities that beggared belief, was never the ultimate prize. It was merely the fuel. The true engine of his ambition was a desperate, all-consuming need for legitimacy and power. He craved the adoration of the masses and the respect of the elite, who had for his entire life looked down on men like him. He did not want to join their world. He wanted to conquer it and rebuild it in his own image. This desire gave birth to the myth of the Paisa Robin Hood. He poured millions of his illicit dollars into the poorest barrios of Medellin, building housing projects, soccer fields, and distributing cash to the needy. This was not altruism. It was a strategic investment in loyalty, a way to cultivate a human shield of popular support that the state would find impossible to penetrate. His compassion was purely transactional. It was from this psychological crucible of megalomania, insecurity, and strategic populism that the dream of Hacienda Nápoles was born. He needed more than a network of safe houses and secret airstrips. He needed a capital for his shadow kingdom, a monument that would stand as a physical testament to his power, a place where his self-image as a benevolent king could be staged for all to see. The location he chose, in the sweltering lowlands of Puerto Triunfo, was a strategic masterpiece. It was remote, easily defended, and far from the prying eyes of Bogotá. The oppressive heat and humidity created a natural barrier, a zone of discomfort for outsiders. Here in this isolated expanse, he could carve out a sovereign territory where the only law was his will. The state's authority dissolved miles before its borders. The land itself became his canvas. He did not simply build upon it, he terraformed it, sculpting hills, digging artificial lakes, and reshaping the very geography to fit the contours of his fantasy. It was an act of creation that mirrored his own self-conception, a man who could bend the world to his design through sheer force of will. The estate was not built on the land, it was imposed upon it. The architecture was a direct reflection of his mind, a chaotic mix of Spanish colonial pastiche, gaudy luxury and kitsch spectacle. There was no unifying aesthetic, no sense of refined taste. The goal was not beauty but overwhelming impact. It was designed to intimidate, to disorient, to communicate a power so vast it was beyond the comprehension of ordinary men. Nothing embodied this philosophy more than the estate's entrance. The archway, crowned with a replica of the small plane that carried his first shipment of cocaine north, was the ultimate act of defiance. It was not a confession but a boast. He placed the evidence of his foundational crime at the very threshold of his palace, transforming an act of illegality into a symbol of origin, a coat of arms for his criminal dynasty. The private zoo was the estate's symbolic heart, and the most profound expression of his ego. The illegal importation of over 1,500 exotic animals was a logistical nightmare that only a man with his resources could solve. But the purpose was not zoological. It was a performance of absolute dominance. To cage an African elephant in the Colombian jungle was to declare that the laws of nations and even nature did not apply to him. Each creature was a living trophy, a subject in his personal fiefdom. The hippos, the rhinos, the giraffes, they were all prisoners in a gilded cage, their wildness contained and curated for his amusement. They represented the entire world, captured and brought to his feet. He was a modern Noah, but his ark was a prison built to satisfy a singular pathological vanity. The concrete dinosaurs that dotted the landscape were part of the same psychological project. They stood as monuments to a power that transcended human history, a claim to a dominion over the ancient and the extinct. Combined with the living zoo, the estate became a grotesque museum of conquest, a landscape of pure will where every element, living or inanimate, served as a mirror for its owner's boundless self-regard. Hacienda Nápoles was therefore not a home. It was a psychological construct, a fortress built to ward off the ghosts of a modest past and the encroaching reality of his own monstrosity. It was the physical manifestation of a narcissistic dream, an attempt to build a paradise on a foundation of terror. But a structure built from such contradictory materials, a desire for love and a reliance on fear, a craving for legitimacy and a life of crime, is inherently unstable. The cracks were there from the very first stone that was laid. The empire's profits did not evaporate into the abstract world of offshore accounts and numbered Swiss vaults. They flowed back into the earth, a torrent of illicit cash made solid. Hacienda Nápoles was where the ephemeral wealth of the cocaine trade became concrete, steel, and manicured lawn. Every brick laid, every tree planted, was a money laundering operation of the most audacious kind, transforming drug revenue into a tangible declaration of power. The construction was a logistical feat that mirrored the trafficking operation itself. It required a private army of architects, engineers, and laborers, all sworn to a secrecy enforced by fear. Materials were imported, regulations were ignored, and the state, in this remote corner of the country, was a distant and irrelevant concept. The estate rose from the jungle not as a piece of architecture, but as an act of secession. This was not a home. It was a capital city for a shadow nation. It was designed to function as a self-sufficient fortress, capable of sustaining its ruler and his court indefinitely. It had its own power generators, its own water supply, and its own internal economy of loyalty and terror. To enter its gates was to cross a border into a sovereign territory, a personal kingdom carved out of the Colombian wilderness. The main villa was the throne room of this kingdom. It was a sprawling Spanish colonial-style structure, designed to evoke the old-world legitimacy of the landed aristocracy. But it was a clumsy imitation, a facade of heritage built by a man with none. The architecture lacked subtlety, its grandeur coming from scale rather than sophistication. It was the desperate attempt of new money to purchase the gravitas of old power. Inside, the rooms were a chaotic museum of grotesque luxury. Imported marble floors reflected the light from gaudy crystal chandeliers. Heavy, ornate furniture, upholstered in velvet and animal skins, filled vast spaces that echoed with emptiness. The walls were adorned with a mix of priceless antiques and art of questionable taste, each object chosen not for its beauty, but for its price tag. It was a space designed to overwhelm, not to welcome. This opulence was a weapon. It served to intimidate visitors, from rival traffickers to corrupt politicians. A meeting held in these rooms was an exercise in psychological dominance. The sheer, suffocating weight of the wealth on display was meant to communicate that its owner operated on a different plane of existence, where the normal rules of engagement did not apply. Negotiation here was a form of surrender. But the villa was more than a monument to questionable taste. It was a boardroom. In the formal dining room, over meals served on gold-rimmed plates, strategies for assassinations were discussed with chilling calm. By the side of the enormous swimming pool, with its panoramic view of the manufactured paradise, the logistics of car bombings were meticulously planned. The aesthetic of leisure was a thin mask for the mechanics of war. The estate functioned as the central nervous system of the Medellin cartel. It was from here that orders were dispatched, routes were managed, and betrayals were punished. Its remoteness made it the perfect command center, impenetrable to surveillance and insulated from the chaos it unleashed upon the nation's cities. Here, in the tranquil humidity, the storm was conceived. Secret passages and hidden compartments were rumored to be built into the very structure of the house. Bunkers, deep underground, were said to hold caches of weapons and emergency supplies. The mansion was designed with paranoia in its DNA, a physical manifestation of a mind that saw enemies around every corner. It was both a palace and a panic room, a stage for power and a shelter from its consequences. This dual nature was its defining characteristic. On the surface, it was a family retreat, a place where the owner could play the part of a benevolent patriarch, surrounded by his children and the laughter of his guests. This performance of domesticity was crucial. It was a mask of normalcy, an attempt to humanize a man whose actions were profoundly inhuman. Yet beneath this performance lay a sinister reality. The estate's vast, unpatrolled grounds were an ideal location for activities that required absolute privacy. Testimonies from former insiders speak of the property being used as a site for torture and executions. The serene, man-made lakes reflecting the blue sky were rumored to be the final resting place for those who had crossed the line from ally to liability. The jungle's silence was a perfect accomplice, swallowing screams and concealing secrets. The very beauty of the landscape became a tool of terror. The contrast between the idyllic setting and the brutality it concealed was a form of psychological warfare, a reminder that in this kingdom, life and death were subject to the whims of a single man. Perhaps the most potent symbol of this perverse duality was the private zoo. It was the estate's beating, wild heart. The collection of over 1,500 exotic animals was a logistical masterpiece of illegal smuggling, a testament to a power that could defy international treaties and the laws of biology with equal ease. To cage an African elephant in the Colombian jungle was the ultimate act of hubris. Each animal was a living trophy, a conquered piece of a world that its owner sought to dominate. The rhinos, the giraffes, the kangaroos, they were all subjects in his personal fiefdom, their wildness contained and curated for his amusement. They were a constant, breathing display of his global reach, proof that nothing on earth was beyond his grasp. The zoo was also a sophisticated propaganda machine. It was open to the public for free on weekends, a calculated act of generosity that cemented his image as a local benefactor. Thousands of poor families from the surrounding region would flock to see the wonders he had brought them. They saw not a drug lord, but a generous provider, a man who shared his fantastic world with them. This loyalty, bought with the spectacle of caged beasts, became an invaluable human shield. But the zoo, like the mansion itself, had a hidden function. It was a symbol of absolute control. The man who could tame a hippopotamus could certainly tame a rival or a politician. The iron bars of the cages were a constant, silent threat. They were a reminder that in this world, everything and everyone could be imprisoned. The collection of classic cars was another facet of this obsessive need for possession. It included over 100 rare and vintage automobiles and motorcycles, each one meticulously restored. The centerpiece was the bullet-riddled car in which the American outlaws Bonnie and Clyde had met their end. The acquisition of this macabre relic was telling. It was an identification with other famous criminals, an attempt to place himself within a lineage of legendary rebellion. The estate was a landscape of pure will, where every element served as a mirror for its owner's ego. The life-sized dinosaur statues that dotted the grounds were a claim to a power that transcended human history. They were monuments to a self-image that bordered on the divine, a declaration that his dominion was timeless. Hacienda Nápoles was therefore not a refuge from the criminal world. It was its most complete expression. It was a place where the logic of the drug trade, unlimited money, absolute power, and a total disregard for law was allowed to blossom into its most grotesque and fantastic form. It was a laboratory for a sociopathic imagination. The parties held there were legendary, lasting for days. They were a toxic mix of hedonism and business, attended by a cross-section of Colombian society: politicians, military officers, beauty queens, soccer stars, and musicians. These events were orgies of excess, but they were also strategic operations. Loyalties were bought, alliances were forged, and compromising information was gathered. In the haze of alcohol and cocaine, secrets were spilled and vulnerabilities were exposed. The mansion's hospitality was a trap, its generosity a web. To accept an invitation was to become complicit, to be drawn into an orbit from which there was often no escape. The property was also a fully functional military base. It served as a secure warehouse for an arsenal of weapons, explosives, and vehicles used in the cartel's terrorist campaign. The same garages that housed the classic car collection also stored the car bombs that would later detonate in the streets of Bogotá and Medellin. The paradise was the staging ground for the inferno. Every part of the estate was weaponized. The private airstrip, essential for flying in exotic animals and party guests, was also the logistical hub for cocaine shipments and the transport of hitmen. The beauty of the place was its camouflage, its reputation for fantasy, a distraction from its function as a center of gravity for organized crime. The mansion was an extension of its creator's personality, grandiose, contradictory, and pathologically insecure. It was a mask of legitimacy, a weapon of intimidation, and a psychological bunker designed to keep the outside world at bay. It was a desperate attempt to build a reality that could match the scale of a monstrous ego. The structure was designed to project an image of untouchable power, a fortress of impunity that no authority could penetrate. Its very existence was a challenge to the state, a declaration that a new power had risen in Colombia, one that built its own palaces and made its own laws. But a fortress built to keep the world out also becomes a prison. The high walls and armed guards that protected the estate from its enemies also isolated its owner from the reality he sought to dominate. The mansion became an echo chamber, a world where his every whim was catered to and his delusions were never challenged. It was a living organism, growing and mutating with the empire it served. Each new wing, each additional exotic animal, each new layer of security corresponded to a new level of power and a deeper descent into paranoia. The house was not merely a reflection of the man, it was his accomplice. What does it say about a man's ambition when his home becomes his most effective weapon, his most elaborate disguise, and his most isolating prison? Perhaps the most telling detail, the one that best captures the vanity at the heart of this entire enterprise, is a matter of debate. Was it the private zoo, a collection of conquered nature? The entrance gate, a monument to his first crime, or the sheer overwhelming scale of the fantasy itself? The reign was absolute. Hacienda Nápoles, now complete, pulsed with a life of its own, a vibrant, monstrous heart pumping wealth and fear throughout the nation. The parties held on its grounds became the stuff of legend, grotesque ballets of power and excess. Under the heavy tropical sky, the air thick with perfume and cigar smoke, A cross-section of a corrupted society converged. Politicians with forgettable faces and flexible morals mingled with beauty queens whose smiles were assets on a balance sheet. Soccer stars, heroes to the masses, drank alongside the sicarios who were their shadow world equivalents. The host moved among them not as a criminal but as a monarch. He was a figure of unsettling charisma, a man who could order a car bombing in the morning and gently cradle his child in the afternoon. His generosity was a performance, his hospitality a weapon. Every glass of champagne offered, every favor granted, was a silken thread in a web of obligation. To be a guest at Hacienda Nápoles was to be seen, to be acknowledged by power itself, but it was also to be marked, to become complicit in the spectacle. This was the empire at its zenith, a kingdom built on a mountain of cash so vast it defied conventional logic. The daily profits, estimated in the tens of millions of dollars, did not arrive as neat wire transfers. They came as a physical flood of used American banknotes, a dirty, cumbersome river of paper that presented a logistical problem as immense as the trafficking operation itself. The money had to be moved, counted, stored, and, most importantly, cleansed. Before it could be laundered, it had to be hidden. The sheer volume of currency overwhelmed traditional banking systems and safes. The solution was primitive and brutally effective. The earth itself became the vault. Across the estate and countless other properties, pits were dug and filled with cash packed in plastic barrels or metal containers. These secret stashes, known as coletas, became a part of the cartel's mythology, whispered legends of buried fortunes that haunted the landscape. The money was a physical burden. It rotted in the damp soil, was eaten by rats, or simply lost to memory. It is estimated that 10% of the annual cash earnings were written off to spoilage and misplacement, an acceptable loss in an enterprise of such impossible scale. The problem was not a lack of wealth, but an excess of it. The empire was in danger of drowning in its own profits, of being suffocated by the physical evidence of its success. This is where the invisible mechanism of the empire began its work. The first stage of the cleansing cycle was local. A significant portion of the cash was injected directly into the economy of Medellin. It flowed through a vast network of front companies that looked on the surface like legitimate businesses. Fleets of taxis, their meters running on illicit fuel, clogged the city's streets. Construction companies, funded by drug money, threw up entire neighborhoods, transforming the urban landscape. Each taxi ride, each bag of cement, was a small act of money laundering. The criminal enterprise became deeply embedded in the city's legitimate economic life, making it impossible to separate the clean from the dirty. The man who was poisoning the nation was also, paradoxically, one of its most prolific builders and employers. This created a powerful and dangerous dependency, a shield of popular support built on a foundation of economic necessity. The laundering operation was a work of crude genius. It required an army of accountants, lawyers, and financial fixers who operated in the gray zones of the law. They created complex corporate structures, shell companies, and offshore accounts that moved the money in a dizzying shell game, making its origins increasingly difficult to trace. The cash, once buried in the Colombian dirt, would reappear as a clean asset in a bank in Panama or the Cayman Islands. But the most audacious laundering scheme played out in the open, under the roar of a stadium crowd. The investment in Atlético Nacional, Medellin's beloved soccer team, was a masterstroke of public relations and financial alchemy. The club became a conduit for washing millions. Player transfers were inflated, ticket sales were falsified, and the team's success, fueled by drug money, bought something priceless: the love of the people. Soccer was more than a business. It was a passion, a religion. By becoming the patron of the city's team, the drug lord transformed himself into a civic hero. He was not just providing jobs, he was providing glory. The victories on the field washed away the blood in the streets, creating a powerful emotional bond with the populace that no amount of state propaganda could break. The stadium became another fortress, one defended by a legion of loyal fans. This intricate financial architecture could not exist without a parallel architecture of corruption. The state was not an obstacle to be overcome, it was a commodity to be purchased. The empire's power rested on a simple, brutal philosophy: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Every official, from the lowest-ranking policeman to the highest-ranking judge, was presented with this choice. They could accept a bribe that would change their family's life forever, or they could accept a bullet. Most chose the silver. The cartel's payroll was a shadow state, a parallel government that often functioned more efficiently than the real one. Police commanders, military officers, judges, and politicians were all on the take. They provided intelligence, sabotaged investigations, and looked the other way. The system was not just corrupted, it was hollowed out from the inside, its institutions becoming mere facades maintained for the sake of appearances. Hacienda Nápoles was the capital of this shadow state. It was here, by the side of the pool, that envelopes of cash were exchanged and loyalties were sealed. It was in the villa's opulent dining room that politicians were given their marching orders. The estate was a place of negotiation and intimidation, where the line between guest and hostage was dangerously thin. To be summoned to Nápoles was to be reminded of who held the real power in the country. The mansion was the central nervous system of a global criminal enterprise. Its telephone lines, secured against eavesdropping, were the conduits for orders that sent tons of cocaine north and dispatched hit squads across the country. Its private airstrip was a logistical hub, receiving shipments of weapons and chemicals and sending out planes laden with drugs. The entire operation was managed from this isolated, idyllic fortress. Behind the facade of family life and constant parties, the business of terror was conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. Meetings were held in soundproofed rooms to plan assassinations and bombings. Ledgers were meticulously kept, tracking payments to hitmen and bribes to officials. The mansion was a corporate headquarters, where the product was cocaine and the primary business strategy was violence. The owner was a micromanager, obsessed with every detail of his operation. From his sanctuary, he controlled a global network that spanned continents. He approved smuggling routes, set prices, and personally authorized the execution of rivals and traitors. The tranquility of the estate was a deceptive calm at the eye of a hurricane of violence that he alone directed. The sheer scale of the operation required absolute control, and absolute control bred a deep and corrosive paranoia. The fortress, designed to keep enemies out, also served to lock its master in. The walls of Hacienda Nápoles, guarded by a private army, became the boundaries of his world. He was a king who could not walk freely in his own kingdom, a prisoner in his own paradise. This isolation transformed the mansion into a psychological bunker. It became an echo chamber, where the owner's delusions were amplified and his worst instincts were validated. He was surrounded by sycophants, men whose survival depended on their ability to agree with him. There was no one to challenge his decisions, no one to question his increasingly erratic and violent impulses. The very air in the mansion grew heavy with suspicion. Every servant was a potential informant, every guest a potential traitor. The internal security apparatus was as fearsome as the one directed at the outside world. Betrayal was the ultimate sin, and it was punished with a theatrical cruelty designed to terrorize anyone else who might consider it. The serene lakes on the property were rumored to hold the secrets of these internal purges. Power, in its most absolute form, had revealed itself to be a cage. The man who could have anything he wanted was trapped by the very things he owned. The estate, with its zoo of caged animals, had become a perfect metaphor for his own condition. He was the most powerful creature in his own collection, and also the most imprisoned, pacing the confines of a golden cage built from fear, wealth, and his own monstrous ego. The first crack in the monolithic facade of power was not inflicted by an enemy, but chiseled from within, by the very ambition that built it. The desire for wealth had been satisfied beyond any rational measure. Now, a more corrosive hunger took hold, the craving for legitimacy. The owner of Hacienda Nápoles, the undisputed king of a criminal underworld, decided he wanted to be a statesman. He sought a seat in the Colombian Congress. This was a profound strategic error, a misreading of the very nature of his power. His strength lay in the shadows, in the ambiguity between myth and man. By stepping into the harsh, unforgiving light of public life, he made himself a tangible target. He traded the invincibility of a phantom for the vulnerability of a politician, exposing himself to a level of scrutiny he was unequipped to handle. His election in 1982 as an alternate representative was, for a fleeting moment, the pinnacle of his ascent. He walked the halls of power in Bogotá, the same halls his car bombs would one day terrorize. But his presence was an affront to the nation's fragile institutions. He was a narco in Congress, a wolf who had not bothered with sheep's clothing. This brazenness awakened a dormant resistance within the political establishment. That resistance found its voice in a single unbending figure, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the new Minister of Justice. Lara was a man of a different caliber, immune to the twin currencies of silver and lead. He saw the drug lord's presence in government not as a political compromise, but as a cancer upon the republic. He made it his personal mission to expose the true source of this new congressman's fortune. The confrontation was inevitable and public. On the floor of Congress, Lara Bonilla held up a newspaper from years past, linking the aspiring politician to a long-forgotten drug trafficking arrest. He unmasked him, stripping away the carefully constructed facade of the benevolent businessman and revealing the common criminal beneath. The public humiliation was a wound to the ego from which the empire would never recover. Stripped of his political immunity and his public mask, the owner of Nápoles retreated to his fortress, but he did not retreat from the fight. The humiliation curdled into a cold, homicidal rage. Lara Bonilla had not just exposed a man, he had challenged an emperor in his own court. Such an act of defiance could only be answered in one language. On the night of April 30th, 1984, on a busy street in Bogotá, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla's car was riddled with machine gun fire. The assassination of a sitting cabinet minister was a declaration of war. It was the moment the conflict ceased to be a cat-and-mouse game between criminals and police and became an existential struggle for the soul of the nation. With that single act, the drug lord crossed a line, transforming himself from a problem into a national emergency. The state, for all its corruption and weakness, was forced to respond. The assassination galvanized a terrified political class. The government's most feared weapon, long dormant, was brought back to the table: extradition. The prospect of facing justice in a United States federal court, far from the reach of his bribes and threats, was the one thing the kingpin truly feared. It was a fate worse than death. His response was a campaign of terror unprecedented in its scale and savagery. If the state wanted war, he would give them a war that would bring the country to its knees. His new motto echoed through the streets: "We prefer a tomb in Colombia to a jail cell in the United States." It was the beginning of the era of narco-terrorism. The violence escalated exponentially. Judges who signed extradition orders were murdered. Politicians who spoke in favor of it were targeted. The assassination of Luis Carlos Galán, the leading presidential candidate and a fierce proponent of extradition, was the empire's most audacious challenge yet. It was an attack on democracy itself, an attempt to decapitate the state and bend it to his will. This all-out war began to strain the empire from within. The constant violence drew a level of international attention, particularly from the United States, that was bad for business. The cartel, once a loose federation of traffickers, began to splinter under the pressure. Partners who had once shared roots and profits now saw their leader as a liability, a mad king whose personal vendettas were threatening the entire enterprise. The rival Cali cartel, always more discreet and businesslike, saw an opportunity. They watched as their main competitor waged a costly and self-destructive war against the state. They began to quietly cooperate with government forces, feeding them intelligence, content to let the authorities dismantle the Medellin operation for them. The enemy was no longer just outside the gates, it was now within the criminal underworld itself. This external pressure and internal fracturing amplified the paranoia that had always lurked beneath the surface at Hacienda Nápoles. The fortress became more insular, its atmosphere thick with suspicion. The owner saw traitors everywhere. The circle of trust shrank until it included only his most loyal sicarios and family members. The sprawling estate, once a symbol of boundless freedom, began to feel like a gilded cage. A new and terrifying force emerged from the ashes of his own brutality: Los Pepes, a Spanish acronym for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This shadowy paramilitary group was a monstrous alliance of convenience, funded by the Cali cartel and composed of rival traffickers, former associates he had betrayed, and victims of his violence seeking revenge. They knew his methods, his safe houses, and his networks. They began to wage a parallel war, one that mirrored his own tactics with terrifying precision. They targeted his lawyers, his accountants, and his front companies. They bombed his properties and hunted down his allies. They operated outside the law, a dark reflection of the very terror he had unleashed. The empire was not just being attacked, it was being devoured by its own children. The cracks were no longer just political or strategic, they were becoming physical. The sanctity of Hacienda Nápoles, the untouchable heart of the kingdom, was violated. Police raids became more frequent, more daring. Intelligence, supplied by informants from within his own crumbling organization, led authorities closer and closer to the center of the web. The laughter by the poolside grew strained. The exotic animals in their cages seemed to pace with a nervous energy that mirrored their owners. The illusion of impunity, the very foundation upon which the estate was built, had been shattered. The walls of the mansion still stood, gleaming under the tropical sun, but they no longer felt like a fortress. They felt like a tomb, waiting for a body. The end did not arrive as a single decisive blow, but as a slow, systemic hemorrhage. The king was a fugitive, a ghost moving between safe houses in the city he once ruled, his world shrinking with every passing day. Hacienda Nápoles, the vast, beating heart of his empire, was left behind, an undefended flank, a monument waiting for its own funeral. It was no longer a fortress but a liability, a sprawling, high-profile target that tethered him to a past he could no longer afford. The state, finally cornered into a fight for its own survival, had forged a new weapon. The Search Block, an elite unit of the Colombian National Police, was created with a singular, unwritten mandate: to hunt the hunter. Trained, funded, and equipped with American technology and intelligence, they were a cold professional force, immune to the old currencies of silver and lead. They were the state's answer to an enemy who had declared himself a state unto himself. But the official war was shadowed by a darker, more intimate one. Los Pepes, the alliance of his victims and rivals, waged a campaign of parallel terror. They moved through the underworld like a virus, dismantling his financial networks, assassinating his lawyers, and targeting his family. They used his own methods against him, a grotesque mirror image of his own brutality. The empire was not merely under siege, it was being eaten alive from the inside out. Hacienda Nápoles became the ultimate prize in this multi-front war. To conquer it was to conquer the myth itself. Its manicured lawns and artificial lakes became a symbolic battlefield where the fate of the empire would be publicly decided. The house, once the epicenter of absolute power, was now just a location on a tactical map, circled in red. The assault came at dawn, the hour of ghosts. The thick, humid air over the Magdalena Valley was sliced apart by the rhythmic thumping of Black Hawk helicopters. They appeared over the horizon not as liberators, but as birds of prey, their shadows sweeping across the silent, dew-covered grounds. The roar of their engines was the sound of an era ending, a brutal mechanical intrusion into a landscape of manufactured fantasy. The operation was a display of overwhelming force. Elite soldiers, clad in black, rappelled onto the lawns with disciplined speed. They moved past the peeling fiberglass dinosaurs, the creatures of a forgotten king's imagination, now silent witnesses to a new, more lethal predator. The contrast was absolute, the state's grim reality descending upon a world built entirely of illusion. The famous entrance gate with its replica Piper airplane was not breached. It was rendered irrelevant. The soldiers swarmed over, around, and through it, a tide of force that no single point of entry could contain. The symbol of the empire's audacious beginning now served as a footnote to its violent end. The defiance it once projected had curdled into a hollow, pathetic irony. The main villa was stormed with professional violence. Doors splintered, and the sharp, percussive sound of forced entry echoed through the cavernous rooms. The agents fanned out, their boots grinding on the imported marble floors, their weapons sweeping across the gaudy, ornate furniture. The house, designed to intimidate with its scale and opulence, was now a tactical problem to be solved, a space to be cleared and secured. Inside, the atmosphere was one of a place abandoned in haste. A half-finished glass of wine on a table, a child's toy left on a velvet sofa. These small human details stood in stark contrast to the inhumanity of the business conducted here. The air was thick with the scent of stale luxury and the palpable ghost of fear. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a crime scene waiting to be processed. The search was methodical, a systematic autopsy of a dead kingdom. The agents were not distracted by the gold-plated faucets or the crystal chandeliers. They were looking for the machinery of the empire hidden beneath the skin of its wealth. They tapped on walls, searching for the hollow sound of a hidden compartment. They pried up floorboards hunting for the legendary calitas. In a hidden chamber behind a false wall in the master bedroom, they found not cash, but something far more valuable: ledgers. Meticulously kept accounting books that detailed payments to hitmen, bribes to politicians, and the names of informants. It was the empire's nervous system, exposed on paper. The myth was being dismantled, one line item at a time. The violation was total. Every corner of the fantasy was stripped bare and examined under the cold light of investigation. The private bullring, where deals were celebrated with blood and sand, was combed for evidence. The empty, rusting cages of the zoo were searched, their silence a testament to a power that had already fled. Every element of the dream was catalogued as an exhibit in the trial of its creator. While the search block conducted its official dissection, Los Pepes performed a more visceral ritual of desecration. They descended upon the garages that housed the prized collection of classic cars. They did not come to seize assets, they came to burn effigies. The collection, including the macabre trophy of Bonnie and Clyde's death car, was doused in gasoline and set ablaze. Flames licked at the chrome and steel, melting metal into grotesque, twisted shapes. The fire was an act of pure vengeance, a message sent in a language of destruction that the fugitive king would understand intimately. It was a declaration that his world, and everything he valued in it, was being turned to ash. The smoke, black and acrid, rose into the tropical sky, a funeral pyre for a dynasty of excess. When the raids were over, the house was left profoundly changed. It was no longer a palace but a hollowed-out carcass. Yellow police tape crisscrossed the grand doorways, and evidence markers littered the floors like strange, numbered tombstones. The opulence that once served as a weapon of intimidation now looked merely pathetic, the garish stage for a tragedy that had reached its final act. The agents and soldiers departed, taking with them the boxes of ledgers and photographs that would help bury the empire. They left behind a silence that was deeper and more final than any that had come before. It was not the quiet of privacy or the calm of power, but the absolute ringing silence of abandonment. Stripped of its master, its purpose, and its aura of invincibility, the mansion began to die. The relentless humidity of the jungle, once held at bay by air conditioning and constant maintenance, seeped into the walls. Mildew bloomed on the velvet upholstery. The first green shoots of wild vegetation pushed their way through cracks in the swimming pool's foundation. The fortress was breached not only by men, but by nature itself. The fall of Hacienda Nápoles was the public execution of a myth. The concrete body of the empire lay broken and exposed, its secrets plundered. The structure that was meant to project eternal power had proven to be just stone and mortar, as vulnerable as the man who built it. The collapse of a fortress built of concrete and steel forces us to ask what constitutes real power. Is it measured in the monuments we build to our own vanity, or in the legacy that endures after those monuments have turned to dust? If you believe some stories are etched deeper than stone, subscribe to our channel to witness other falls from grace. The king died not in his palace, but on a sloped middle-class rooftop in the city he had held hostage. On December 2, 1993, Pablo Escobar, the lord of Hacienda Nápoles, was gunned down by the search block. He was barefoot, his body bloated, a common criminal cornered far from the artificial lakes and caged beasts that had once mirrored his power. The empire ended not with a bang, but with the undignified thud of a body falling onto red clay tiles, the final pathetic punctuation to a reign of terror. With its master gone, Hacienda Nápoles became a ghost. The state, in an act of symbolic reclamation, expropriated the land. But the government's bureaucracy moved slower than the jungle's hunger and the greed of men. The estate, once the most heavily guarded piece of real estate in the country, was left open, a carcass for the vultures of rumor and desperation to descend upon. It was no longer a fortress, but an invitation. They came in waves, the treasure hunters known as guacheros, drawn by the phantom of the caletas. They arrived with shovels and pickaxes, with dynamite and legends of plastic barrels filled with rotting dollars. They were the inheritors of the empire's most corrosive myth that wealth, buried and uncounted, could be found by anyone with enough will to tear the world apart in search of it. They were a pathetic echo of the man who had built the place. The villa was dismembered, walls were sledge-hammered into dust, priceless marble floors were ripped from their foundations, and the manicured gardens were scarred with craters. The house was not just decaying, it was being systematically tortured, its physical body violated in the hunt for its financial soul. The search for money, the same force that had erected the monument, was now the force that was erasing it from the earth. The animals, the living trophies of a dead king, met a more orderly, though no less tragic fate. A massive logistical operation, a reversal of the one that had brought them to this jungle prison, was undertaken to relocate the survivors. Giraffes, rhinos and zebras were crated and shipped to zoos across Colombia and the world, their strange, surreal chapter in the Magdalena Valley finally over. They were the lucky ones, but 4 creatures were left behind. The hippopotamuses, 1 male and 3 females, were deemed too large, too aggressive, and too expensive to move. They were an inconvenient loose end, a biological problem with no simple solution. So they were abandoned to the artificial lakes of the estate, a small, forgotten population of African giants left to fend for themselves on a continent that was not their own. Freed from their enclosures but trapped in a foreign ecosystem, the hippos did what nature commanded. They survived. They thrived. They multiplied. The original 4 have become a sprawling, lumbering dynasty of over 160, the largest invasive species on the planet. They have moved far beyond the crumbling gates of the estate, colonizing the great Magdalena River, a living, breathing plague born from a criminal's vanity. They are his most enduring legacy. Not the fleeting empire of cocaine, not the buildings that turn to rubble, but a biological time bomb that continues to tick. These creatures, with their immense bulk and unpredictable aggression, are a constant, dangerous reminder that when a man attempts to bend the laws of nature to his will, the consequences can outlive him, wandering the earth like restless, destructive ghosts. Today, the estate has undergone its most surreal transformation. Hacienda Nápoles is a theme park. Where the machinery of a global drug empire once operated, there are now water slides and food courts. The laughter of children echoes across lawns where assassinations were planned. The horror has been sanitized, packaged and sold as family entertainment, a monument to a nation's complex and perhaps necessary amnesia. The entrance gate with its replica airplane still stands. It is no longer a defiant proclamation of criminal origin, but a quaint historical curiosity, a backdrop for tourist photographs. The raw audacity of the symbol has been diluted into an anecdote, its power neutered. It is the perfect metaphor for the entire property, a place where the past has not been erased, but merely rebranded. The land itself feels heavy, a palimpsest where the bright, shallow text of a theme park has been written over a dark, indelible script of violence. The concrete dinosaurs, their fiberglass skins peeling under the sun, now seem less like monuments to a timeless power, and more like the kitsch tombstones of a forgotten, monstrous dream. The ground beneath the feet of paying customers is layered with secrets the tour guides will never tell. The mansion, which once sought to contain the world, has itself been contained by a new narrative of harmless spectacle. The wildness it once celebrated has escaped, now roaming the countryside in the form of its abandoned beasts. What, then, is the true nature of a legacy? Is it the walls a man builds to declare his power? Or is it the monsters, both real and metaphorical, that escape when those walls inevitably fall? If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.